Okay, guys, we are here for section 4 of your Unit 9 notes. That's this day right here. We are looking at doing the court cases of the 1920s worksheet for tonight for homework. The two court cases that are on there are going to be the cases of Sacco and Vanzetti. And then the second one is the Scopes monkey trial, both of which we're going to go over in the notes today. But that just gives you a little synopsis of each one. And if you're looking for help on that worksheet, there is another video to help walk you through that as well. Alrighty, let's get to it for today. So the 1920s makes it sound like everything was great, everything was booming, but there is a darker side to the 1920s, and not everybody got along, and not everything was perfect and pretty and happy. So let's take a peek underneath and look at those social problems, the changing attitudes of the 20s. Now, when I say Red Scare, you guys think, okay, we've got the Cold War. No. Look at the time period that we're in, 1918 to 1920. This is what we call the first Red Scare. The second wave of the Red Scare is going to take place in the 50s. That's going to be the one that you're thinking of right now. But the first Red Scare takes place right after World War I. Now, let's take a peek. So we are going to see in this period following World War I, communist revolts spreading throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Communism is going to take hold in the Soviet Union under Vladimir Lenin. They're going to overthrow the dynasty there, and it is going to be terrifying to the United States because we think, oh my goodness, if it worked over there, it's going to happen here, and we are then going to have communists taking over our government. People are going to look at labor unions and say that labor unions are full of communists. They're going to say that the strikes labor unions use to get those better conditions, better wages, better hours are going to they're going to be the first step in the communists taking over our government. We are going to look at what's happening over in Eastern Europe and say that could spread to the United States, which is going to create fear for the people at home. So, what is the Red Scare? It is a wave of fear of suspected communists and radicals that would be plotting revolutions within the United States. How do we combat this? Well, first, we are going to see what we call Palmer raids. They are going to be named after the Attorney General at the time, Mitchell Palmer. What he did was begin these raids that resulted in arresting thousands of radicals such as anarchists in the United States and immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Why immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe? Well, that's where we saw communism taking place. We assumed that they were communists. What is a Palmer raid? It is a raid of a house, people going in, police going in, ransacking the house looking for any evidence of communist activity, arresting these immigrants, these anarchists, and sometimes deportation. So you're going to see this extreme measure being taken. Now, before we move forward, I want you to take a look at this little video on the Red Scare in history.
Hi, my name is Rahul Williams. I'm a historian, and here are some things that you need to know in order to sound smart about the Red Scare. Although most people associate the Red Scare with the era of Joseph McCarthy from the 1950s, in fact, there were two major Red Scares. The first Red Scare took place during World War I. After the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia during the First World War, fear of communism reached its height. In the period after the Second World War, Americans were increasingly concerned that the anti democratic and totalitarian nature of communism would spread and even infiltrate the United States. One of the common traits shared by both Red Scares was red baiting, the practice of identifying and attempting to out or uncover suspected communists within the United States government. One of the chief conduits for ferreting out communists was the House Un-American Activities Committee. Although it had been first formed in 1938, it reached the height of its power, and some would say its insidious purpose, during the 1950s Red Scare. Southern politicians often branded political subversives with whom they disagreed as communists. In Alabama and Mississippi, for example, the NAACP, which was a civil rights organization, was banned as a communistic influence. The second Red Scare perhaps took its greatest toll on artists and entertainers, people like Paul Robeson, Arthur Miller, and others who were unable to work because of being branded as suspected communists or communist sympathizers.
So you can notice that the label of communist, it really varied. It didn't have to be people who were from Southern and Eastern Europe. It didn't even have to be people who really were communists. And we're going to see that theme of we pick out those that are different, or maybe that we want to target and call them communists to kind of get them taken care of as a theme in the second wave of the Red Scare. Let's take a peek at the first trial here. So the American Civil Liberties Union. This is going to be a group that goes after checking the government and what they're doing based on the civil liberties or the rights that we have. And this was formed in response to the Red Scare, trying to protect the rights of Americans that were being targeted, saying that they were communists, being subject to the Palmer raids. We're going to try to protect them. So, one case, we have Sacco and Vanzetti. Both were Italian immigrants and both were known anarchists. Remember, anarchists believe that we should not even have a government. Down with the government. That the people should rule themselves. Not an idea that's very well supported by the American people. What they are going to be prosecuted of is that they were accused of killing 2 men in a holdup. Now, there is very little evidence that says that they did any of this, that they were even there, that they were the ones that killed these guys. But they're going to be found guilty and sentenced to death, even without strong, concrete evidence. Why are we even looking at this case? Because the men were charged, they were convicted on what we call circumstantial evidence, which is just like people said that they were there, that they didn't have an alibi. There's no real concrete, like they found the gun on one of the guys. But instead, they're going to be charged based on their political views and the fact that they were immigrants. And that is going to be why they were targeted rather than the actual facts of the crime. This case represents the nativist attitudes at the time. Remember, we talked about nativism a while back, believing that only the people born in the United States are the ones that are superior. That idea that if you're an immigrant, you're not as good as somebody who was born and raised here in the United States. Also, this shows that the government does not support immigrants. It shows that they're taking a stand against immigrants. So really, this was more to make the people feel good that the government was doing something about these supposed dangerous immigrants in the United States. You'll read more about this case for homework tonight. Let's Look at the nativism that was rushing through the United States. This, again, recap the idea that native-born citizens are favored over immigrants. This is going to become a stronger belief in the United States post-World War I, after the Russian Revolution, and during the Red Scare. We are going to see the Emergency Quota Act be passed in 1921. Remember that from the political cartoon above. That was that setting of the quota, the limit on how many immigrants from each different country could come to the United States. And then the National Origins Act is going to be passed in 1924, which made that quota system permanent. The National Origins Act, when you see that, that is the limit on how many immigrants from each nationality could come to the United States. We're also going to see the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, forming at this time in cities that opposed labor unions. I bet we didn't know this. The KKK went after more than just African Americans. They went after Catholics, they went after Jews, they went after immigrants. It didn't have to just be black people in the United States. They went after anybody who was different, because they were really forming based on that idea of nativism. So the opposition, the people who opposed the KKK, are going to embrace that idea of the melting pot. Remember, Great American Melting Pot, the key word there was blend. Blending everybody together. We're all immigrants. We're all different. So you've got those two opposing sides there. Prohibition. I know that you have been waiting for this forever. So let's go back a little bit before we get into it. World War I is going to increase support for the temperance movement. Remember, you get a bad temper when you drink. The temperance movement was against alcohol in the United States. What the temperance movement after World War I is going to say, or during World War I is going to say, is that it's unpatriotic to make alcohol when we could be using supplies to make more food for soldiers. So really going after people here and saying, you're un-American, you're unpatriotic if you're drinking alcohol, because that's a waste. We should be making more supplies. We should be targeting our energy towards helping the soldiers. So we are going to see the 18th Amendment ratified or passed in 1919. The 18th Amendment is going to forbid the manufacturing, distribution, and sale of alcohol. So you can't make it, you can't sell it, you can't pass it around or ship it around the United States. In retaliation of this, people are going to make their own alcohol. They're going to smuggle it in. You have bootleggers who are going to sell alcohol illegally. You'll see speakeasies that come up where those are those secret bars that sell alcohol. Prohibition, we're going to watch in a second, creates the mafia, because now we are having organized crime to sell alcohol in the United States. Prohibition is going to be wildly unsuccessful. It cannot be enforced. You can't have enough people, enough police force going around and stopping people from making it in their basement, selling it, drinking it at dinner. There just isn't enough manpower to take care of it. So, eventually, in 1933, so 13 years later, 14 years later, the 21st Amendment is going to be ratified, reversing prohibition. The idea is there in the beginning with the temperance movement that, it's taking money away from families, it's a waste, it's hurting children, all of this, but it just can't be monitored, and that's where you see the failure. But let's go into what I know you're really interested in is the creation of the mafia. Take a peek at this video here.
Going into the 1920s, many people believed banning alcohol would make America more peaceful. They were wrong. Violent murders, widespread corruption, and the dawn of organized crime defined the decade and beyond. In the years leading up to the 1920s, anti-alcohol activists such as Carrie Nation had been hard at work building a case against the demon drink. And they had some legitimate arguments. Prohibitionist women advocated for temperance as a means of combating their abusive, alcoholic husbands. Industrialists got behind the movement because they thought alcohol was limiting the potential output of their average worker. But temperance was also used by racist organizations as an outlet for their xenophobic views against the millions of European immigrants coming to the United States. The Germans and Irish in particular were scorned for their alleged drunkenness. Whatever their reasons, 46 states ultimately ratified the 18th Amendment, with only Connecticut and Rhode Island dissenting. Prohibition officially took effect at the very start of the decade, enforced by the language of the Volstead Act, named for House Judiciary Chairman Andrew Volstead. Within a year, Americans' alcohol consumption had already dropped to historic lows, but the drop was temporary. Americans didn't stop drinking. The 18th Amendment allowed for some loopholes: fermenting grapes at home, prescriptions from doctors, and religious exemptions. A lot of people found God. But the eradication of a corporate structure for alcohol production and distribution left a huge opportunity for a large-scale, organized, and insanely profitable black market. Existing small-time street gangs took advantage, quickly evolving into vast, bootlegging criminal enterprises. They employed everyone from warehouse workers to truck drivers to accountants. Gang leaders would bribe politicians, cops, even the prohibition agents themselves, nicknamed prohies, to ensure their businesses ran smoothly. Some relied on rum running, illegally importing liquor from other countries and storing it in warehouses across the U.S. Sometimes they would simply distill liquor in private homes. Other gangsters bought abandoned breweries and operated them in secret. They worked in the shadows, but one part of the business was very public: the violence. Gangs fought for territory in the streets of major U.S. cities. Chicago was especially violent. 729 people were killed by gangs in Cook County alone during Prohibition. The most famous of these incidents was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. Men working for Al Capone, dressed as policemen, gunned down 7 rival members of Bugs Moran's gang against the wall of a parking garage. No one was ever charged for the crime. Realizing cooperation could lead to greater profits, many gangs agreed to treaties that allowed them to operate peacefully in their respective territories. Johnny Torrio attempted to organize the gangs in Chicago, with Al Capone as his right-hand man. When Torrio retired to Italy and handed the reins to his protege, Capone inherited a business pulling in more than $1 billion a year in today's terms. Charles Lucky Luciano organized the Italian and Jewish gangs in New York under Joe the Boss Masseria, before Luciano had Masseria killed in 1931, and had his successor, Salvatore Maranzano, killed the same year. Luciano went on to found the Commission, a national crime syndicate composed of New York's 5 mafia families and the controlling families in Chicago and Buffalo. Prohibition ended with the ratification of the 21st Amendment in 1933, but the mafia kept rolling along. These crime families had already entered the worlds of loan sharking, prostitution, and illegal gambling, just to name a few, and continued to grow throughout the country on the backs of their profits from Prohibition.
You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as American citizens. If so, what are they? Paid by tax.
So you can see that Prohibition may have done a little bit more damage, been a little bit more dangerous than what it was worth. Ultimately, when we look back on Prohibition, it was a failure by the government. The Scopes monkey trial. The 1920s is really this struggle between those that wanted to keep tradition and those that wanted to move forward into this modern life, this modern movement, the new advancements. And the Scopes monkey trial really shows us that struggle. So You guys may remember Charles Darwin, his finches, all that good stuff. Charles Darwin develops that theory of evolution. Now, I'm not going to get into all the sciencey stuff because you know that's not my thing. But what I do know is that Charles Darwin, the root of evolution, says that complex forms, such as humans, develop from simpler forms, such as apes. Now, not everybody likes that theory of evolution. In 1915, in Tennessee, there is a law that's passed that says it is illegal to teach evolution in schools, based on the idea that we shouldn't be peddling this idea that goes against religion, because based on the Bible, which is what people had been studying for years in schools, it says that God created the earth. And evolution, that does not go along with what the Bible story says. So, because this law is passed, you're going to see the American Civil Liberties Union again getting involved in this trial, because they say that this law in Tennessee goes against the freedom of religion. Freedom of religion doesn't just mean you can pick any religion you want to follow. It means you can also pick to not follow a religion, to believe in science. So the ACLU is going to convince a biology teacher in Tennessee to break that law, because the only way to test a law in the courts is to break it. So the ACLU gets John Scopes, who was a biology teacher, to teach evolution in his classroom. That is breaking the law as passed by Tennessee. So Scopes is arrested. He's found guilty of breaking the law, but this court case just takes off. People all over the country now have their attention turned to the Scopes monkey trial, because they want to hear this story break out between we have William Jennings Bryan, who was defending the Tennessee law, and it becomes this kind of show that's being put on. Ultimately, Scopes was found guilty of breaking the law because he did teach evolution in schools, but the case overall comes to represent this idea of the argument between culture and religion, the modern versus the traditional, and that's what's really important here. So when we look at the 1920s as a whole, this is going to be a time of advancement for the country. Our economy is taking off, we're seeing new inventions being made, but there are contradictions between culture and tradition. We have clashes among the people based on culture and tradition, and this is going to be this time where society is changing. And from here on out, we either have to accept those changes or fall behind. So the 1920s, really what we're looking for here is this advancement, this change out of our traditional culture of the United States into something bigger. Now, next time we get together, we're going to start looking at the causes of the Great Depression, so moving out of those roaring 20s into the time of the Great Depression in the 1930s. As always, any questions, let me know. Thanks for tuning in.